I think both you and I share quite a kind of expansive view of how we should apply the term fascism, not as really not trying to say, is this object fascist or not? Is this person fascist or not? Is this campaign fascist or not? But looking at fascism as a kind of process, a constellation, which isn't totally bounded, and sets of relations. So I think if we're going to talk about the ways in which Trump's fascism was in play, maybe we can talk about what kind of process that looked like and how it has shifted or not, or accelerated since 2016, and the way it kind of reflects a broader fascistic process outside of that campaign.
I mean, I think in a sense, it's the disjunction between the fascism as a process and then fascism as a slogan to identify a threat that was particularly striking in this campaign in particular. So we've seen different moments in which the term enters into a very mainstream media discourse, and also in the speeches and positions of people in the Democratic Party. Biden had used not that long ago this term, which I then discovered was actually part of Communist Party rhetoric in the 1930s, semi-fascist, which was kind of intriguing return. And then what seemed to be this kind of somewhat desperate ploy towards the very end of this campaign, really to foreground the Hitler's generals line, etc. But what was really evident was that there was no effort, or no serious effort, except for the association of the term fascism to the Project 2025 issue, to really make evident this issue as one that links to a whole set of other levels, from all of the policies that are being carried out by MAGA Republicans in state legislatures, creating, states now that, really embody the pretty extreme dimensions of what the Republican Party stands for. Or making it, or being able to articulate how this question relates to the everyday, right? So I think the thing that was very striking in an election where the rhetoric coming from the Trump campaign, including in its sort of grotesque monster truck, WWF, Madison Square Garden rally, etc., was more and more willfully, in a trolling-like sense, extreme. Like, we're really going to show you what a kind of fascist Republican campaign would look like. But the more than the term itself seemed to be entirely devoid, or largely devoid, of any popular effective impact, right? And I think, I think that leaves anti-fascists on the left and critical commentators on this in a bit of a quandary, right? That you have the term fascism returning as a kind of, as a term that's being used in a campaign in a very mainstream sense, but in what was obviously an ineffectual way, whilst you have these processes that are increasingly pushing in directions that a certain kind of fascist analytic or fascist frame gives you an insight into. So I think that's what I sort of came away with, right? This contradictory dynamic whereby almost the more the terminology of fascism was taken up by a liberal centrist position, the less they were able to think about how this might be related to all sorts of other phenomena. And then, of course, this became extremely, the contradictions were just, completely intensified by the fact that the very people who were telling you that fascism was a threat are complicit in an ongoing genocide, which completely undermines, I think for a lot, not just for like people on the left or critics, but I think just in a wider sense, like, who are you to, who are you to tell us about threats to democracy when you're not just providing cover, but entirely integrated into, one of the worst war crimes and in living memory, right? So I think that also had a deeply disaggregating and undermining effect on any of that rhetoric.
Right. Yeah. Who do you want to hear claiming their opposition as a fascist, who themselves are hardening the border, prosecuting a genocide, have spent their entire career in terms of Harris bolstering the very kind of police state that black radicals in this country have decried as fascism for so many decades? It kind of evacuates the term of any useful meaning for an anti-fascist response if someone who has taken up so much fascist activity is claiming beware fascism from, the very performed clown-like extreme, Charlie Chaplin style dictator. So I don't think it was a helpful or a particularly useful intervention from the Harris campaign, because it kind of was certainly policy very thin, morally thin. And then in terms of the Trump campaign, things like the kind of obscenities at the Madison Square Garden rally and the kind of pleasure taken in cruelty, and the kind of excesses of like what it can look like to buy into a campaign of domination and control and power and your body, my choice. And, there's no intervention in that kind of like pleasure if you're not offering people a program where a kind of more nurturing, mutually flourishing collective survival and pleasure can be achieved. So, if people are going to turn to something more kind of obscene and violent and related to domination and power, whatever the Democrats had to offer was not going to be sufficient at all. And I think we're seeing that failure as just, a huge underlining of that failure. From which I hope there will be lessons of. I don't expect there to be lessons from the Democrats, because, people have been pointing this out, not just in the US, when you've seen centrist parties feed into far-right successes throughout Europe, in India, in lots of places, you've seen centrist acquiescence to far-right policy just feed into the far-right. And people have been warning about this and claiming this, and they say, no, we're keeping the far-right at bay, and keep not doing that for unsurprising reasons. And if you spend your whole campaign talking about the border crisis and talking about crime and talking about how people should be very, very happy because the economy that is not serving them is in fact very good, you're not going to actually keep people away from the far right that says, sure, you're saying the border's dangerous, we will go further. And so you just see this constant convergence drifting all the way to the right. And the only lesson for the Democrats to learn would be to absolutely stop doing that. And I don't think they will. But the left, I think, can be more confident in the analysis that there can be no acquiescence to the far right or far right policies on the assumption that it will actually hold the far right at bay. Because it does not. Yeah.
Which is a very old story that in Europe we know very well also, right? And it's also the story in a completely different, in many ways, political ecology and conjuncture of what happened in France with Macron and the Rassemblement National. And it's a story that's the story of the normalization of the far right all over Europe, right? Especially around migration and the violent repression of migration, as well as then more, so-called culture war-like issues and so on, right? That with a center that's chased those positions and has passed legislation whose extreme repression of the rights and mobility of migrants, for instance, are always presented as an antidote or as an antibody, because in some sense, why would we need fascists, right? If
we'll fascist ourselves.
If we are already doing the deportations, we're also doing them in order, right, to prevent fascism, right? Which reaches asymptotically towards we're doing the fascism so that we don't have to, have the fascism, right?
Right. Whereas in the end, all that does is, of course, solidify something in people's mind as a problem to then indeed respond to, rather than demystifying these claims that the wealthiest economies in the world can't take in millions of more people. Of course they can. And indeed should stop in imperialist projects that produce more and more need for migration. But no, certainly if you continue reaffirming the claims that there is some sort of crisis in need of an answer, be it crime, be it migration, that is a race to the bottom. The far right will win.
And it's also where you locate the crisis, right? So one of the things about evoking the language of fascism is that you seem to be evoking both an exceptional politics, exceptionally violent, exceptionally racist, exceptionally dangerous, but also politics that responds to exceptional times, right? To times of crisis, of interregnum, disorientation, instability, etc. And the very odd stance of centrists who invoke the language of fascism is the inconsistency vis-a-vis where the crisis is located, right? Because they're at one and the same time telling you that the economy's never been as good, that people have never had it as good. And then at the same time, they're chasing the right on what the right presents as a crisis, but as a crisis that's affecting everyone else, right? So on the Trumpian side, it's, migrant crime, the border is presented as this moral and social panic, but also somehow related to whatever pain people are feeling in a more quotidian economic sense, whether it's inflation, whether it's debt, or whether it's something else. And so in that sense, that fascistic articulation makes sense, right? But if you're telling everybody that everything's kind of great, for which they should, in a sense, be thankful in this kind of condescending discourse, but then at the same time, you're chasing the tough on the border. It's like, well, why are you being tough on the border if we're all fully employed and there's no crime issue and everything's fine, right? Like, so you're engaging in this incoherent activity of responding to the crisis that the right is saying is a crisis, but not actually making it as something that involves everyone's everyday life. So, and that's that articulation, that linking of issues, and I kept thinking, as many people have, of a lot of the Stuart Hall analyses of Thatcherism in the 1980s and Hard Road to Renewal and other texts of that period, Politics of Thatcherism. And, the centrality of how different terms and affects and issues are, made to mean something in an articulated ensemble of sorts, right? And the incapacity of the Harris campaign and the Democrats more broadly to make those articulations in a way that would be popular or effectively mobilizing was so evident when you saw those down ballot measures where people in deep red states passed measures, to partially defend abortion rights or minimum wage, in Missouri and elsewhere. And there was like a 20% gap between a campaign that's supposedly running on that, right? Like, so you're supposedly running on like abortion is key and we defend the unions, and somehow nobody's getting this or hearing this or thinking that somehow there's something about Trump that they want, whilst also providing themselves in a sense with breaks and kind of safeties to that, right? Like, so, maybe they obviously everybody knows that the Republicans are against abortion. So what does it mean that you voted for a measure to defend abortion, but have also voted for a right-wing Republican candidate whose campaign is so-called pro-life, right?
Yeah, we would need a little bit, because, we're recording this sort of early days of this election, so we would need a little bit more kind of granular analysis there, because what I think we saw in those states, I don't, and again, I could be wrong when this kind of analysis is clearer, I don't think we did see a lot of people going tick for Trump, tick for abortion protection. I think we saw people saying no tick.
Yeah.
and then tick for abortion
Yes.
protection. Because
So
if you
desertion and defection
Right.
from the Democrats,
and
but not
understanding
yeah.
quite correctly that, empirically speaking, this was not a party that was going to defend reproductive rights in any robust way, nor a party that, whilst there were certain labor wins under Biden, undeniably, since midway through Biden's tenure, certainly turned into more of a, war economy only austerity president. All of the, promises, the kind of Bernie friendly-ish promises of the beginning of the Biden campaign completely swallowed. And again, an administration prosecuting a genocide, unapologetically. So, what you didn't see, as far as we can tell so far, and we can be pretty confident at this point, you didn't see millions more people defect to Trump.
No.
And you saw, notable shifts, and there's going to be a lot of very unpleasant media analysis pointing at certain demographics, particularly Latino men, trying to play demographic blame games. But it seems totally feasible to me that people are interested in voting on ballot measures, and that's why, God bless certain ballot states, certain, can
Not
go very
California
wrong.
necessarily.
Yeah, can go, and, you saw in California people voting against a more formal abolishing of slavery. Appalling. But in the red states where you did see ballot measures succeed that were for, yes, albeit limited protection of abortion and some pro-worker measures, and then Trump winning anyway, I think this may well have been a question of people just not putting their, wanting to give Harris a mandate. What that shows us is how profoundly the Democrats have failed to represent the things they claim to. And it's interesting when you're talking about the kind of incoherence of their positioning and the incoherence of their rhetoric and discourse. Because incoherence really only works well
on the far right.
Yeah, if you embrace it. Trump embraces an incoherence.
Yeah. Let Israel finish the job, but go to Dearborn, Michigan, and say you're going to end the war.
Exactly. And it's, which is why if I hear another liberal centrist point out hypocrisy for the next 4 years, if we have hypocrisy discourse for one more minute, I'm starting to throw tables. But if you are the party that does claim to be coherent, sensible, a wise guide through, an array of interlocking crises, and yet you are so consistently incoherent. I think it speaks to the Democratic Party for what it is, which is you cannot be a party of Wall Street and Silicon Valley and a party of the worker. And they made their choice.
They made their choice, but I was even struck by the fact that they refused to engage in tactical or cosmetic compromises or gestures at certain points that would have allowed them to further their core program, but have enough of a subordinate or subalternized worker coalition to back it, right? So at the beginning of the Harris campaign, I thought, the rallies with Sean Fain, the Trump is a scab. I thought, okay, there's a kind of momentum that maybe they're trying to incorporate that dimension. And then, the moment that there was such an evident pivot to the Cheneys, Mark Cuban, the Uber lawyer,
this very weird imagined vote.
all of which I was bewildered, not because I imagined that they were any different than this through line of the Clintons and Obama and that party structure and etc. But just because I thought they had people who were professional enough and were running the numbers carefully enough that they would have allowed them to shape their messaging in ways that had some mobilizing effect, right? And the point that you indicated just about the sheer levels of defection, the sheer level of loss of votes, right? And that's one of the odd things about the statistical thinking that goes into all of these racialized stereotypes of agency. You know, why did the Latino men do this, or why did the black men do that, etc. As if, right, they were operating as distinctive collectives, rather than like all of these voters left, and the people who just stayed put seem to be a movement, right? Like they seem to have acted because 10 million, it's not that these are, but the discourse is as if the same amount of people voted and a number of black or Latino men more were energized by Trump to defect, so to speak, right? Rather than this other, you know, again, we don't have a fine-grained enough analysis of who voted for the first time, who stayed home, etc. But the tendency to present it as a movement of new voters with an agency related to their gender and racial identity is also this weird fiction that, you know, or that plays really well, that, you know, that you know, a certain centrist media, you know, feeds on with glee, right? Also because it allows this culpabilization and, you know, and you see even worse, like delirious and racist forms of this online, you know, in the genre of like, after everything we've done for you. Kind of. And I think that was another element that really struck me about the debility of the campaign was just the paternalistic and condescending way in which these constituencies are then identified, right? You know, whether it's these, you know, that slightly or rather farcical, like here are like 5 points for black men and like crypto and weed, you know, it's like, you know, that everybody was making fun of, etc. But I think also that sense that the incoherence and the chaos of the Trump campaign is less offensive to people in a certain way, because there's insult and there's racism, but they're not patronizing or condescending or expecting you to be a voter, except for the Jewish vote, which he has a very weird, like, you really should vote for me, and if not, bad things are going to happen to you, and so on, which is, you know, this is messed up, twisted anti-Semitic narrative. But the Democrats really, like, I think there's a lot of a sense in which a lot of people are extremely put off by the sense that you owe them your vote. And that condescend, if you knew your own interests, right? You knew that you have it better under us, etc. And I think, you know, partly because a sense of antagonism and disaffection with the political class is much deeper in this country as in so many other ones that people are willing to accept, right? And so the narrative is like, who is more liked? It's like maybe who is less hated, or who, you know, or which party your contempt is oriented towards, and of course the incumbent has an advantage in that sense. But yeah, so I think that dimension played for me a very significant role, and it's also something where the Democrats, there's a resonance between the Democrats and then other centrist formations around the world that have both ceded and are incapable of resisting a far-right or authoritarian surge, with this politics of reasonableness and respectability and this complete incapacity to really understand how much contempt there is out there and how much justified contempt there is out there for a political class that keeps telling you that you're doing really well when in fact your life is full of misery.
And there's more unhoused people, and there's, you know, people, housing is more expensive than ever. One other point that I think pulls your point around this kind of extraordinary willingness to leave votes on the table, I suppose, and the kind of calculi that went into that. Obviously, what I think we've also seen, if we're thinking about the limits of co-optation of a certain type of centrist liberalism and liberal capitalism, we have seen attempted, and in certain ways, among certain contingents, obviously, and certainly within the media, the success of certain cooptation of feminism, cooptation of pretending to care about LGBTQ rights, cooptation of anti-racism and black liberation, obviously with always laughable performances, if you think of Nancy Pelosi and like kente cloth. But when we really see when the limit is hit of cooptation, it's always Palestine. And it like hits a hard wall. And I think that should be a hard wall and the limit hit that we should see kind of reverberate backwards to the limitations of that kind of cooptation per se, of all our anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-racist struggles, because they were always kind of deeply flawed, deeply cynical efforts anyway, and certainly never connected a kind of race class, gender class, anti-imperial class struggle at all when performed by the Democrats. But when you see the hard wall hit, and that hard wall is Palestine, as we saw at the DNC, not even letting a Palestinian American speak with a pre-checked speech on the main floor. And you saw delegates walking around, leaving a protest, covering their ears as protesters were reading the names and ages of children slaughtered in Israel's genocide. Extraordinary stuff. Then I think what this should be a death knell for is not intersectional struggle. And I really do fear that like a leftist, populist might frame itself as anti-fascism too, will say, see, look, you know, the most popular ad for Trump was about trans kids. Or, see, look, people who focused on Palestine really fucked this. Whatever it is, I would be very worried about a left populism that says, okay, so no race issues. Okay, so no trans issues, as opposed to demystifying the way the right so misuses and so cynically manipulates those issues to produce fear-mongering, to produce this notion of threat. But what we do see is what we cannot allow for is any sort of synonymizing or thinking in the same time as liberal identity politics, liberal co-optation of struggle around vulnerable communities, and leftist liberatory struggle with and from those communities intersectionally together with an eye on material existence and survival. I think if this election, if there's anything to pull from this election that might, I mean, there's a number of things, but like something fruitful is just like, okay, no, calling time once and for all on the kind of co-optation machine that finds its hard limit in Palestine that should tell us something. And, you know, but upholding and demanding and being actually really quite vigilant against an answer to that says, okay, class only, fuck all y'all. Because I worry about that. You're already seeing it.
Yeah, I would totally second that. It's particularly galling also vis-a-vis a campaign that didn't run on any anti-racist, pro-trans, you know,
yeah, the Democrats didn't say anything about trans.
That's what. There's also something really surreal about watching. Also, a lot of the mainstream commentary, right? You know, Kamala was buried by woke. It's like I don't. You know, where exactly was that at the foreground, right?
Yeah, even in terms of abortion, she was like, maybe I'll. Let's hope Roe comes back was pretty much her line, but yeah, and I think the way both, as you rightly put it, that that the Palestine exception to progressivism has now, you know, completely exploded or revealed, right, the bankruptcy of that politics of co-optation, but then also on the other side, how we've seen for, you know, a whole year, but obviously this goes back decades, that beneath the supposed polarization, the level of coherence and collusion and entanglement
between the two parties over their support both for Zionism and for occupation and apartheid and now for genocide is remarkable. Like, you saw all of those bills equating anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism, the ways in which democratic governors and mayors, etc., entirely, threw themselves into the work of repression, of even the mildest forms of dissent and so on. So I think that has also been very, revealing, and has also, undermined these these vociferous claims that, we stand, between you and fascism, right? When at the same time, there's a real willingness to cohere on a whole set of issues, right? And especially when one views everything that's happened also from outside of the United States, right? Then what appear in a certain internal discourse as these, gulfs, right, of discourse and politics, etc., are insignificant for most of the world, right? And to the point that, the geopolitics and the militarism under and the genocide under Biden and Harris are such that in certain places people are kind of not in a totally disabused and cynical way saying, well, perhaps the volatility or the isolationism or what have you, or and the transactional character of Trump, as I think somebody noted recently in a commentary, make other publics and other nations orient towards these questions in a very different way, right? Also because so much of the Trump foreign policy, well, I mean, it's the U.S. imperialist foreign policy, but even some of the things that were specifically introduced under Trump, vis-a-vis China, or also like the whole Abraham Accords, the fact that there was no serious effort to reintroduce the Iran nuclear deal, all of that, right? Like, so massive continuity, the continued and like abject decision to press on with the embargo of Cuba, which was one of the most obscene kind of foreign policy positions, where it now is just Israel and the U.S., right? All of that together, again, when one views the election and its repercussions and consequences from outside, especially through the prism of Palestine, but also through other, perhaps partly interlocking issues, then casts a really grim light on the mainstream of the Democratic Party presenting itself as anything, as a better, perspective, or a better, the only way that it's presented is in this, again, with the austerity and the war economy also came this level of Cold War, like zombie Cold War nostalgia, then, embodied in these, grotesque figures like Blinken and Matthew Miller, etc., where you really feel like, it's you've crossed a kind of threshold into a sort of weird self-caricature, at times seemingly knowing self-caricature, like Matthew Miller's endless, smirks, and that whole performance of U.S. power, which is so degraded at this point, and has almost no, other than that, at a purely transactional level, has like no global resonance whatsoever, right? And that's very different than even under Bush. I think the level of hollowing out of any like claim for consent, I think is pretty bewildering, and the kind of like, the symbolic collapse also of all of their endless blather about the, the rules-based international order and the like, in the face again of Palestine. I think it, has also, dug under like the identity of the, even of the centrist Democratic Party, liberal international order, and etc.
these like bizarre calls for it to basically be like these like American century calls, like we'll bring back production, we'll bring back industrial factories into the US. It's like, at what scale? We have a care economy. Put money into the care economy. It's like, you're going to take on China? Like, no, it's really, really absurd.
On EVs and
exactly.
or solar panels that are still like a fraction of a percentage of
and just not where workers are. But I also think in terms of the fascism question as this relates, pointing out that on a global stage, the consensus between Democrats and Republicans to be the parties of empire and the parties of capital, of course, makes them the kind of fervent ground to be in the process of producing a fascist country. You know, like the same like Brechtian point that one must not speak of fascism without speaking of the capitalism from which birthed it. I mean, on a global stage, that's trying to draw a distinction between which party served that set of processes better becomes like a nominal difference. Which, of course, is not to say that there won't be pain for people under Trump to a degree, a non-negligible degree, far worse than had Trump not come into power and had there not been, moved to Republican control of both houses and there being a mass Republican control of the judiciary. I don't want to pretend it's not worse for many millions of people, but on a global stage, it's pretty arguably the idea that they would see a grand difference is probably laughable. Yeah.
Which I guess brings us to the anti-fascism question.
Yes. I don't know what you think of it. My answer is the same as it ever was. And it's the same as, it's the same as the Black Panthers in the 60s and 70s that used fascism as a hinge to call into being an anti-fascism. If you name something as fascism, it's a perlocutionary speech act, right? It's like you call into being an anti-fascism. And I think that's the same now as it is then. You look at the kind of constellations that produce fascist relations of domination where they are, and you fight against those relations of domination. And I think that's as true under Trump as it would have been under Harris. The fight against cop cities everywhere, student encampments for Palestine, really fights against police. I think so often articulate what an anti-fascism in the US should and can and must look like. Because a fight against police isn't just fighting against the streets, right? It's fighting against an infrastructure. For example, against the growth of cop cities, for example, against, who has property that gets protected, how are people swept away and put in, prisons or swept into the subways and then away from the subways, and, who gets to move or stay still or how. So I think that's the same anti-fascist struggle as ever. But it is to push away from a anti-fascism that is the anti-fascism of whatever Harris was talking about.
Of the simulacrum of a frontism that has no base whatsoever. Yeah. Right? I also wonder about the repertoires and the histories of anti-fascism, right? And I think the point that you raised about the Panthers is really vital, because from that vantage, anti-fascism was not viewed primarily as a movement of defense against the street violence of white supremacists. Not to underestimate that either in this moment, because this has created a structure of license and permission for all sorts of vigilantism, more or less legalized, from the sheriffs to the militias and so on. But I think that sense that the core is a struggle against the repressive apparatus of this racial state, right? And also of a state that is, especially in its and especially in a lot of its local manifestations, becoming, an armed policing of social and bodily reproduction as well, right? Including in these, dystopian scenarios of, policing women's menstrual cycles that J.D. Vance was linked to. I mean, entering into a whole domain, and also, trying to police movement between states. I mean, there's a lot of aspects of this that I think are also, very sui generis to the constitutional structure, right, of the United States, how the organizing needs to play out, right? It's very, I think it's also different than in certain European contexts where, of course, you organize locally, you have forms of mutual aid and self-defense, etc., but that the state is kind of more homogeneous in a sense, right? Whilst here, in many ways, there's so much that is already happening and would have continued to happen even had Harris won, right? The way that Florida has been massively transformed under DeSantis, the extreme kinds of politics against abortion rights in all sorts of other places. And that was not going to be, stopped, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, it's extremely frightening and consequential that now these transformations at the level of the state have a level of federal coordination and acceleration as well, right?
Yeah.
And I think, I guess the other question will be, especially in terms of the most, qualitatively and quantitatively imminent, point of fascization, i.e. the deportation program, how that will play out in terms of any more official or organized resistance, right? If one recalls all of the issues around sanctuary cities and, whether there's possibilities of pushing from below certain administrations to enter into forms of, municipal or regional or state, to enter at least into forms of non-compliance, right? Because if they're really going to try to do this, which I think they are, just I don't know exactly at what scale and at what speed. And obviously they're happy to also have spectacle that doesn't necessarily fully manifest, as in the border wall, which is still creating masses of pain and suffering, but doesn't necessarily translate into what they said they were going to do.
Sure.
But I think as far, that seems to me, it seems that will be a real key aspect of organizing, right? Because if it's at this scale, you're not going to resist it just with like mutual aid or people showing up when, if there's few and far between.
To the airport,
and it's not like, people organize with home evictions in Spain after the crisis, right? You can do that at a certain scale, but, if it's the deportation of 10 million people, you cannot, there's not enough like activists and militants or people who you can mobilize in that way. So it will require, right, some relationship to officialdom of one sort or another, right, and some movements of non-compliance, of resistance in that, like, I will not sign this order, I will not, So.
And it's very worrying that with Democrats like these, if you've got Mayor Adams in New York, who for the last year, I mean, hopefully he'll be, now with Trump as president, I'm sure even if he goes to jail, he'll be pardoned somehow. But, with Democrats like the ones we have, we are not seeing in blue states, at least not yet, and it's early days, but we have not seen, robust efforts to actually defend or to act like havens for migrants like they should be. In fact, New York particularly has broken all kinds of laws around the shelter system and limiting how long migrants can stay in shelters and unhoused people, trying to kind of segment the unhoused population of the migrants, and they're not in a pretty classical way of turning class people against each other. And so, more of that is deeply dangerous, and same with, We did not see blue states step up extraordinarily to defend reproductive rights or to defend trans healthcare at all at the times when, before Roe fell, it was extremely difficult to get an abortion in huge swathes of this country. And Democrats just clung to this kind of bastion of Roe. And interestingly, to point to the kind of European comparison, I think actually the mass movement of peoples has shown the limitations of a kind of municipal-only model in Europe, right? I think a lot of those efforts have not been good at, and my main point of reference is Germany, because it's where I spend the most time when I'm not in the US. A lot of those places have not, there are groups like Migrantifa, but a lot of groups have not been good at not reinforcing a kind of nationalism with even on the left. So, I think the same lessons need to be learned everywhere of how we negotiate this and what kind of firewalls can be put up. I think we have to look to labor organizing as well. If we're talking about non-compliance, if you did have a more militant mass labor, I think those can be, what if people aren't willing to fly the planes? What if people aren't? And we've seen sort of aspects of this and, dock worker strikes around, in Greece, around Maersk shipping, commercial ships being used to ship artillery to Israel for the genocide, Spanish embargo that's not being upheld but should be. Different kinds of, attempts at firewalls that I think these have to be pressure points. And they are often points of kind of circulation, right? But yes, it is obviously not reassuring that the democratic leadership we have, not only in the kind of failure of the Harris campaign, but on a city and state level, is the state that it's in, and all the further to the center, which means to the right, in the last year, because you've had the success in a number of cases of AIPAC run campaigns to unseat figures like Cori Bush, who...
Yeah, they were also the winners in this election, as they themselves advertised.
Literally said, And so the kind of efforts to unseat even these kind of what felt like to a kind of democratic socialist left, these great wins, these inroads that some leftist figures represented, that seems to have been really pushed back again. Yeah, it feels like a very back-footed moment. And if either of us or any of our comrades knew what to do, we'd all be doing it 100 times over. But I think there are obviously lessons from histories of resistance that are continuous and that we have to just build on. But I don't think the Democrats are going to be part of it.